Everyone thought they were the perfect couple, until she pulled the trigger in front of the whole church. What drove a quiet wife to murder her husband during his sermon? The truth is darker than anyone imagined. Maple Hollow was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. The streets were lined with maple trees that turned golden in the fall, and everyone knew their neighbor's name. Tucked within this peaceful setting was a little white church with a steeple that touched the sky, and at the heart of that church were Ethan and Grace Holloway. To the townsfolk, they were the very image of love and faith. Ethan, with his soft voice and steady hands, was the town's youth pastor, and Grace, always impeccably dressed, played the church piano each Sunday, like it was her calling. Together, they radiated a quiet strength that others admired and envied. Ethan was the type of man who made everyone feel seen. He would sit for hours with troubled teens, walk widows to their cars after service, and never missed a community potluck. His sermons were simple, heartfelt, and always ended with a reminder to cherish those you love. Grace, though more reserved, was always present. She helped organize charity drives, volunteered at the library, and could be seen watering the flowers outside the church every Saturday morning. They held hands during prayers, smiled at each other during hymns, and had a rhythm between them that suggested they truly understood each other. People often whispered, if only every marriage could be like Ethan and Grace's. Behind the scenes, their life appeared just as stable. They lived in a modest 2-bedroom house just down the road from the church. Their home was filled with framed Bible verses, warm blankets, and the smell of fresh coffee. Ethan kept a vegetable garden in the backyard, and Grace had a shelf full of old music books she read every evening. Theirs was a life marked by routine and gentle devotion. Even after 10 years of marriage, they still celebrated their anniversary with handwritten letters and quiet dinners at the same lakeside restaurant. But all was not as it seemed. For a few months, subtle changes began to ripple through their lives. Grace, who once smiled easily, now wore an expression that seemed distant, almost vacant. During church services, she sometimes played the wrong notes and paused mid-hymn as if she had forgotten where she was. Her once perfectly styled hair now appeared hurried, her clothes slightly wrinkled. Friends chalked it up to exhaustion or perhaps a personal struggle she hadn't shared. Ethan, ever the protector, brushed off concerns and said she just needed time to rest. But deep down, he too had begun to notice the growing cracks in their daily life. She had stopped praying with him at night. She started locking the bathroom door. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and find her standing by the window, staring into the street with a blank look in her eyes. When he asked what was wrong, she would simply shake her head and retreat into silence. Ethan, a man of faith and reason, tried to give her space. He believed that love meant patience. But even he couldn't ignore the growing weight in the air between them. Then, one Sunday morning, she left the church in the middle of the service without a word. No one had ever seen Grace leave the piano like that. Ethan finished the sermon without her. After the service, she didn't return his calls. When she finally came home, she said she had a migraine and wanted to be left alone. He respected her wishes, but something inside him stirred a quiet alarm that wouldn't stop ringing out in a town like Maple Hollow. People notice when things change, but they rarely speak about it. So while Ethan and Grace continued to attend church, walk hand in hand, and smile for photographs, something had already begun to unravel beneath the surface. And soon, what was once seen as the town's most perfect couple would become the center of its darkest tragedy. Long before Grace Holloway arrived in Maple Hollow and became the picture of devotion, she lived another life, one she carefully buried. It was in a smaller town, not far from the border, where she first joined a church community under a different name. Back then, she was simply Grace Mallory. She was younger, less refined, but already carried the same quiet charm. She played the piano, volunteered in Sunday school, and quickly caught the attention of the young pastor, Matthew Claiborne. Their connection was immediate, and within weeks, whispers began among the congregation. She wasn't married, and neither was he, but their closeness raised eyebrows. Then, one day, Matthew disappeared. It was a shock to the town. One moment, he was leading sermons with passion and energy. The next, his house was empty, his car abandoned near the river. Rumors spread. Some said he had run off with Grace, others believed he had a breakdown. Police opened an investigation, but nothing concrete ever came to light. Grace was questioned, of course. She said she had no idea where he went. She seemed shocked, even broken-hearted. But something about her answers felt rehearsed, as if she had already told the story in her mind a dozen times. Within weeks, she left town, changed her last name, and began again in Maple Hollow. For years, it seemed the past had truly died. No one in her new town knew of Matthew, or the whispers she left behind. Grace became someone else, devoted, quiet, dependable. But the past is a strange way of resurfacing, especially when it's soaked in secrets. Nearly 12 years after Matthew's disappearance, Grace began receiving letters. At first, they were simple. A plain envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sentence. "I know what you did to Matthew." No name, no threat, just a cruel reminder. She burned it and told herself it was a prank. But the letters kept coming. Soon, the messages became more detailed. The next letter contained a photograph, an old, grainy picture of her and Matthew standing beside a tree outside the church, a place only a few people knew about. The third envelope had an audio cassette. She didn't own a player, but she found one at a thrift store. When she finally played it, the sound of Matthew's voice filled the room. It was a sermon, recorded years ago, followed by a clip she didn't remember. It was a conversation, one where Matthew sounded angry, asking someone to stop hiding. Her own voice responded, hesitant and cold. That was the moment Grace realized someone had been watching her all along. Someone had evidence. Someone knew. She began locking herself in the basement, going through old boxes, burning papers, checking the locks twice before sleeping. Her health deteriorated. Her playing at church became erratic. Her conversations with Ethan grew sparse. She no longer looked him in the eyes. Every time she did, she feared he might ask about the man she once knew, the man she might have destroyed. Ethan, for his part, had noticed the shift in her behavior, but he chose faith over fear. He believed in redemption. He believed love could overcome anything, but Grace knew better. There was no redemption for her, not for what she did, not for what she buried. And now, someone out there was slowly pulling the past into the present, piece by piece. Her days of pretending were over. And though she didn't yet know who was sending the letters, she knew this. The truth was coming, and with it, everything she had built would come crashing down. The package arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, and had no return address. Ethan found it resting neatly on the front porch beside his Bible. At first, he assumed it was a church donation or perhaps a book someone thought he would enjoy. He carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table, and didn't open it until later that night when Grace had gone to bed. Inside was a single USB drive, black, unmarked, and cold to the touch. Ethan hesitated before plugging it into his laptop. He didn't know why his heart felt heavy, why his stomach tightened as the screen came to life. A single video file appeared on the desktop. No title. Just a date, one he didn't recognize. When he pressed play, the screen went dark for several seconds before a voice, distorted and low, began to speak. It told a story. A story of love, betrayal, and a sudden death that had never been solved. The narrator described a young woman who had fallen in love with her pastor, a man named Matthew. He spoke of late-night meetings, arguments behind church walls, and finally, A quiet retreat into the woods where Matthew was promised love but met something much darker. He said the woman brought something with her, something in a flask. And that after a short struggle, Matthew never came back. Ethan sat frozen. Then the video changed. It showed a series of photos, grainy and aged. One of them stopped him cold. Grace, younger but unmistakable, was sitting beside a man whose face was blurred. She looked happy, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in years. The next image showed the same man near a wooded trail, standing beside a sign that read, Mount Albury Church Camp. The narrator spoke again, this time slowly. She never told you. She never will, but if you ask her, watch her face. Ethan closed the laptop and sat in silence. Rain tapped the windows. Upstairs, Grace was asleep, or at least pretending to be. He didn't know what to do. He had devoted his life to faith, to forgiveness, to understanding. But this was something else. The voice on the USB didn't say her name, but it didn't have to. He knew. He had always known something wasn't right, but now he had proof. The kind of proof that couldn't be ignored. Asterisk. The next morning, he printed a transcript of the video and placed it in a sealed envelope. He made 2 copies, one he locked in the church office. The other he sent to a private investigator whose number he found online. Then he called the police. Not to accuse Grace, not yet, but to ask questions about a man named Matthew who vanished over a decade ago. The person on the other end of the line said they would look into it. Ethan didn't mention Grace's name. He needed to be sure. For the rest of the week, he acted as if nothing had changed. He smiled, preached, led prayers. But he watched Grace closely. She was nervous. He saw it in the way she held her hands, the way her eyes darted to the corners of rooms. She knew something was coming, and so did he. On Saturday night, he prepared. A sermon unlike any he had ever given. One that wasn't just for the congregation, it was for her. He printed every word, folded the pages carefully, and placed them in his Bible. The title read The Weight of Secrets. It would be his last sermon. He didn't know that yet, but she did. Grace had already made her decision. And the next morning, inside the church where they had shared their life, the truth would rise and one of them would fall. Sunday morning arrived bright and clear, as if the sky had no knowledge of what was about to unfold beneath it. The church bell rang at exactly 9, echoing through the streets of Maple Hollow like it did every week. Families dressed in their best filled the pews. Children whispered and giggled, and the elderly nodded to one another with practiced familiarity. The air inside was filled with the usual scent of old wood, fresh flowers, and coffee from the nearby fellowship hall. But there was something else in the air too, something unspoken. A quiet tension that clung to the walls. Ethan stood behind the pulpit with his Bible open in front of him. He had been up all night going over his sermon, reading the words again and again. But now, as he looked out over the crowd, everything felt heavier than paper. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on Grace, sitting behind the piano like always. She was dressed in pale blue, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face unreadable. Their eyes met briefly, and in that moment, he saw it: fear, sadness, and something else. Finality. The service began as usual. Hymns were sung, prayers recited. Grace played the opening pieces with mechanical precision, never missing a note, never looking up. Ethan led the congregation through the early parts of worship with his usual calm tone. But those who knew him well noticed a slight shake in his voice. His words were more measured, his pauses longer. Then came the sermon. Ethan stepped forward, closing his Bible slowly. He held the folded pages in one hand and looked around the sanctuary. He spoke not with anger, but with quiet sorrow. He said there were times in life when the truth, no matter how painful, must come to light. He spoke about redemption, about the courage it takes to confront what's been hidden. His words were carefully chosen. He never said Grace's name. He never directly pointed a finger, but it was clear to everyone who he was talking about. As he continued, murmurs began to rise from the crowd. Grace still hadn't moved. Her hands were now gripping the edge of the piano bench. Her eyes stared straight ahead, wide but expressionless. Ethan was about to read from the final page when she stood up. It was slow, almost graceful. She walked down the short steps from the choir area and moved toward the center aisle. The room went silent. No one knew what she was doing. Some thought she was going to join her husband at the pulpit. Others thought she was coming forward to speak. But then she reached into her handbag. The sound of the first gunshot cut through the church like thunder. Screams erupted as Ethan stumbled back, blood soaking through his shirt. He fell to the ground beside the altar, the pages of his sermon scattering around him like dying leaves. Chaos broke loose. Some ran for the exits. Others ducked behind pews. A few brave souls rushed toward Grace, but she didn't fire again. She simply stood there, the gun falling from her hand, her expression blank. It took less than 5 minutes for the police to arrive, but by then, the damage was done. Ethan Holloway, the beloved youth pastor of Maple Hollow, was dead. He had died in the very church he had served, just feet from the altar where he had married Grace, baptized children, and preached for years. Grace was arrested without resistance. She didn't speak a word. As she was led out in handcuffs, the congregation watched in stunned silence. Some cried. Others stared in disbelief. The sanctuary was still. The piano keys, struck only moments earlier, now sat untouched. The illusion of perfection was gone, and the house of worship had become a house of horror. The investigation that followed was swift but deeply unsettling. For the first time in its quiet history, Maple Hollow was under a media spotlight, its streets crowded with news vans, reporters, and stunned onlookers. The image of Grace Holloway being led out of the church in handcuffs became a symbol of something unimaginable: betrayal inside a sacred place. The community struggled to understand how someone they trusted, someone they admired, could be capable of something so final, so violent. But as investigators dug deeper, the calm surface of Grace's life quickly crumbled to reveal the rot beneath. Within days, detectives confirmed that the mysterious USB drive Ethan received had also been sent to the county sheriff's office, along with a typed letter detailing the events surrounding Matthew Claiborne's disappearance 12 years earlier. The letter had been mailed by an anonymous source, but investigators soon traced it to a man named Adam Claiborne, Matthew's younger brother. He had been quietly following Grace for years, collecting fragments of information, revisiting his brother's case, and watching her build a new life under a new name. His silence had been intentional, but when he discovered she had married a pastor and was living among another unsuspecting congregation, he decided it was time to expose her. Once in custody, Grace refused to speak. She didn't request a lawyer. She didn't cry. She simply sat in the small gray interrogation room, staring blankly at the wall. For 3 days, she said nothing. But when presented with the audio recordings, the photographs, and Ethan's printed sermon pages, something inside her finally broke. Her voice was barely audible as she confessed, not just to Ethan's murder, but to the events that had unfolded. All those years ago, she admitted to poisoning Matthew during a late-night retreat, using a sedative she had taken from a family friend's medicine cabinet. She said Matthew had grown possessive, and when she tried to end the relationship, he threatened to reveal everything to the church board. Desperate and afraid, she planned a quiet evening walk near the camp's edge, handed him a spiked drink, and watched him fall to the ground. She left his body hidden beneath a thick patch of brush, certain it would never be found. She returned to her cabin, packed her bags the next day, and disappeared. In court, Grace's trial drew massive attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former parishioners, and grieving townspeople. Ethan's family sat in the front. row every day, listening to the details of how their son had died while trying to do the right thing. The prosecutor painted a portrait of a woman who had lived a life of deception, someone who had been given a second chance and chose to destroy it when the truth threatened to emerge. Grace's defense made little effort to argue her innocence. They leaned on her mental state, citing years of guilt and psychological torment, but the jury remained unmoved. She was found guilty on all charges: first-degree murder for Ethan and second-degree murder for Matthew. Her sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, she showed no emotion. Just the same empty stare she had worn in the sanctuary on that final morning. The church never reopened. For many, it remained a place of trauma and loss. The building was eventually sold and converted into a memorial site for Ethan, a gentle man who preached love and forgiveness until the very end. A stone plaque was placed at the altar where he had fallen, engraved with a verse he once quoted in every sermon: "The truth shall set you free." But for Grace, truth did not bring freedom, it brought judgment. And in the end, it revealed that even the most trusted faces can wear the darkest masks. Asterisk.